Yeah, sure.
So very, very pleased to have Sara Webb today, which is far away from us, but we have the opportunity to hear what she's going to tell us. Sara is working in Swinburne, Australia, at the Center for Astrophysics and Supercomputing. And she's going to talk us about transient events, what I think she called cosmic needles in cosmic haystacks. So thank you very much, Sara, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for inviting me to talk, and I'm really excited to share some of the work that I've been doing with you. So yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about the different types of machine learning that we use to try find interesting things in transient data, and the actual data we're using is quite unique, a little bit different than what you might expect thinking about ZTF or PTF, where there can be several days gap. I'll be telling you about a program called the Deep Wider Faster program. So here we go. Awesome. So when you start to think about transients, it really can depend on what type of transient you're after, because suddenly in the last 30 or 40 years, we are so rich with the type of transient science we can do within not only our own galaxy, but extragalactic transients. It can be really tricky to try to determine exactly what you're looking for and to build algorithms around looking for a certain thing. So we've seen a lot in the past, and especially in the literature, a lot of machine learning algorithms that are aimed specifically for things like supernovae, or events that are very well categorized and very well understood to a certain extent, and they're quite easy to model and to be able to build predictive algorithms. But what gets a little bit trickier is when we're starting to look for things that are less well understood or even still theoretical. And so what do you use to be able to pull anomalies out of data without biasing yourself? So just go a little bit over how really new the transient universe that we know, and that's our bread and butter, is to us today. So really before the 17th century, there was asteroids and meteors were the most transient thing in the sky and still not well understood, and then planets and planetary motion. And if you were very lucky back in the ye old days, you might get to see a galactic supernovae or two. But until that time, the universe looked very static. Sure, the night sky was changing periodically. Again, you could predict what stars were going to be up at what time given your location on the Earth, but everything seemed to be very static and very unchanging. And it wasn't until only a couple hundred years ago that we started to realize that the stars that seemed so static were actually quite variable, and probably the majority over them are variable at heart. They have some intrinsic transient nature to them, but until we started to be able to quantify their brightness very, very detailedly, we weren't able to really study exactly what this meant. And then really in the last 50 years or so, we have now explored not only is the optical things that we typically see with our eye or with the more standard CCD, but we are seeing transients across the full electromagnetic spectrum, from radio transients all the way up to very short duration gamma ray and high energy transients. And what is interesting about most of these very exciting classes of transients is that a lot of them were found serendipitously. So they weren't found because they were being searched for, but rather they were a product of a different survey or something that really led us to them by chance, which is interesting because then we get to a point where we need to understand, is there anything more out there that we're going to find by chance, or can we design a survey to think about it more critically? So to put all of those different transients into kind of a more scientific space perspective, we can plot them based off how bright do they get, what is their peak luminosity, and how long do they last. And there's a lot of things on here, but basically we see that towards the longer end, we see our classical longer duration events. So TDEs, we see the different types of supernovae, kilonovae, things like that tend to last between a day and longer, which are quite fantastic for us astronomically, because we can point to another telescope, we can call our collaborators up and say, hey, something in the sky, please go look and grab more data. That's brilliant. What gets really tricky though is when we start to look a little bit to the left, I think it's the left, my left of the plot, where we're looking at things like type 1a shock breakouts, fast radio burst counterparts, and things that are still predictive and that are theorized to last on milliseconds to less than an hour timescales. This is where we get quite tricky, because we are really relying on our clever algorithms to discover them in the truck piles of data that we're collecting from all of the different observatories around the world. But also we don't have that reliance of being able to grab it in real time and point to another telescope, call up a collaborator and get more data on it. So again, this is where we kind of come into that more serendipitous discovery post-fact of the observing. So this is kind of those gamma ray bursts, X-ray bursts, fast radio bursts, and pulses, all discovered basically by accident. Very nice accidents to have, but if we want to explore that space very well, we need to have a multi-wavelength approach. Again, most of them are only seen in a single wavelength or a very narrow wavelength band. But for an example, something like fast radio bursts, we're still uncertain about what the counterpart to them along the electromagnetic spectrum outside of the radio would actually be. And so there's all of the theories in the world that we can think of. I think there's 47 progenitor theories of what the progenitor of a fast radio burst is. Everywhere from coherent to decoherent bursts from, either a very large star, a planetary system, black holes collapsing, anything you can think of, we can predict. But what is difficult is trying to prove any of them right without any other multi-wavelength information on the events. And fast radio bursts, for those who might not know, they only last milliseconds, so they are extremely, extremely quick. And if you are using a very large telescope that is gathering lots of data, catching them can be tricky just based on the amount of data you're getting at any single time. So we see fantastic results coming out of ASCAP, Meerkat parks with real-time processing that is being built in now. But for most of the models, where it is a coherent burst model, the theory is that all of the wavelengths that you can imagine are released at once. And we are just seeing the radio, so the longer wavelengths, which means that the shorter wavelengths, the gamma rays, the UV, the optical, arrives at the Earth before we detect the FRB. So it gets tricky, because being able to detect the FRB is fantastic and great, except if we need to understand what it is, we've kind of missed our chance, depending on what the models say. So this is just food for thought for the program I'll talk about later. So then we have a more traditional optical survey a little bit on the right there, and that's our surveys that you tend to think of that have several day cadence, basically image a patch of the sky, go back over time and see what has changed. And this is where we discover those longer duration events, especially supernovae. This is the most ideal survey for supernovae, and now for kilonovae as well, when designed right. So it can get tricky. So the program I'm going to talk about hopes to cover this entire space in many different ways, and it's called the Deeper, Wider, Faster program. So it's run out of here at Swinburne, and the PI is Professor Jeff Cookie. And the Deeper, Wider, Faster program really has 4 main goals to it. So the first one is coordinated, simultaneous, multi-wavelength observations. Say that 3 times fast, but the gist is, we tend to, when we have telescopes looking on sky, it's incredibly rare for any telescope across any wavelength to be looking at the same patch of sky, especially when we're limited by field of view. And so often when exciting things are happening, and we see this a lot with gravitational wave follow-up, is that telescopes need to move very rapidly to get to the same patch of sky. And you end up getting that lag time difference between when you could get data and when you do get data. So the main idea of DWF is to actually coordinate multiple telescopes across the magnetic spectrum, so across radio to gamma ray, all pointing in the exact same patch of the sky, or having a common denominator on the sky and staring at it for multiple hours to try to get full multi-wavelength coverage. The second main aspect is the fact that it's a real-time data processing challenge. So we tend to work with our optical imager doing the heavy lifting. So doing difference imaging in optical images in real time. And that's here at Swinburne. So what typically happens is we have a telescope like DECCAM, the 4-meter telescope at CTIO. we have that imaging the majority of the sky that the rest of the telescopes are looking at every 20 seconds, and we send the data back to Swinburne in real time, which means that then we can difference image and see if there's anything in the optical that has changed. And this leads us to our third point, which is rapid response. So if we see anything new developing, say a brand new supernovae, a very interesting type of stellar flare event, we can then trigger other telescopes to go look at it in more detail, whether it be a different wavelength regime or it could be a spectral analysis and more detailed information on the event. And then finally, we can do longer term follow-up. So we can go back weeks to months later with our optical and very wide field imaging and see, did anything that we saw in real time that looked interesting, did it result into anything in longer term? So that really is the overview for DWF. It is a very unique program with some really cool science and programming, computer science driving it behind the scenes to get it all done in real time. So as I spoke about before, we kind of rely on the dark energy camera to be our main driver to give us the most information about the changing sky in real time. So we do this using 20-second continuous imaging, and with DECCAM, you have a between 20 and 30-second readout in CCD clear. So by the time you get all your images, you have about a 1-minute cadence between the exposure start and exposure end of your next image, which is very good. So it means that every minute we can see what is changing in the sky. What is also really nice about using DECCAM is the quality of the images and the location of it means that we're able to get to about 23rd magnitude in the G band. So we tend to use a blue band to target those more high energy events that we hope have a lot bluer color spectrum. And so we can get to about 23rd in 20 seconds, which is phenomenal. It's a good chunk of the sky that we're able to interrogate. So to date, we've had about 17 different field pointings, and we do go back and visit them over the years with 15,000, I think. Since I wrote this slide last year, I think we're now up to 20 or 25,000 images, lots and lots of individual images. And as you can imagine, over all of those fields, we have millions of sources, which is fantastic, but it leads us to a bit of a dilemma, which is how do we process them? So in real time, we have a whole section looking for things that are changing quite dramatically, but in late time we really want to have the data processed systematically so the wider astronomical community can then go and use our data, because millions of sources, very high cadence, there's lots of science that can be done, not just transient science. And so that was part of my PhD that I worked on, was building this big giant pipeline, which I was just very proud of my PowerPoint effort to make this plot, so I included it. But all you need to know, big pipeline that gives us light curves, which is really nice because now we have all of these sources now categorized into the different fields and light curves for each night. And this is where kind of the fun can begin, because we can dig for different types of sources that we're looking for. So this is all going to be part of a data release later this year, hopefully, and it will have at least 5 million sources in it, and it will be open to the general public, and we'll be doing this through Data Central. So this could be very interesting for any type of different science that you might be working on, being able to have access to these light curves. Hopefully you keep that in mind, and I hope that it offers the wider community something. But let's go back. So we have all of these light curves that are being generated. How do we get through them, and how do we target them for interesting things? So we can go back to kind of like our first principles of astronomy and just use algorithms to find what we're looking for. So something like this, where this is from a flare star that sits below detection threshold and then pops up, but it has a very distinct a rise and a fall. And so you can model that with exponentials, and you could do sliding window algorithmic searches through your light curves, which is very time expensive computationally and manually, having to check them all out, and also restricts you into what you're finding. So the traditional search algorithms, although brilliant, are not fantastic for looking for things that you're not quite sure you're looking for yet. So part of DWF is that we want to explore this very fast cadence data, so this minute data, to be able to see what type of transients exist on this scope. And to do that, we don't want to put ourselves in a box, just assuming it's going to be X, Y, and Z. We want to have it very open because we see with our different light curves, we get all sorts of things happening, all sorts of different shapes. And we end up with so many of them that trying to do it algorithmically, I don't know if that's a word, but if it is, I will take it. It just doesn't work out. And so this is where machine learning comes in. And probably all of you are sitting there going, yes, perfect machine learning problem. And it really is. Time series are fantastic for doing different types of machine learning problems. So we wanted to use an unsupervised approach because we really did just want the data to speak to us and tell us what is standing out amongst the background of the data that really is unchanging. So unchanging sources, and then pop them out to us. So just a quick overview for anyone who's not familiar with a certain type of unsupervised machine learning, which is clustering. So there's many different types of clustering algorithms, and at their very base, what we're trying to do is trying to express our light curves with some properties. So this is just an example here where I've taken a heap of light curves and expressed them in some property. So change of brightness over the duration of the event. And we can see in this dummy example that they separate quite nicely because they have different properties. In machine learning, we call this features, and we want to be able to extract as many features as possible for our light curves. And so we can think of these as just describing our light curve one-dimensionally. So we could have the median value of the light curve, the slope, the kurtosis, all sorts of things that just describe the time series, but collapse it down into one dimension. And so the type of clustering that we chose to use, which I'll touch on a little bit, is hierarchical density-based clustering. And we used features that were not explicitly useful for any certain type of problem. So we used features that hopefully would describe the shape of the light curves, regardless of whether they were periodic, whether they had, some sort of periodicity to them. We tried to eliminate that any of the features had to have that. And we made this really diverse. I think there's 25 features in the end that we end up extracting from each of our light curves to then try cluster in feature space. So we have our 25 features. And this is where kind of the fun begins, because now we can try, now we can try cluster them. So we standardize all the features and then we pop them through this hierarchical density-based spatial clustering. And what this does is, it's hard to imagine because we work in 3 or 4 dimensions, I guess, with time, but we project all of those features up into a 25-dimensional feature space. And we basically ask our clustering algorithm to find the ones that are most similar to each other. And we can imagine in our 25 dimensions, light curves that have very similar features would sit very closely in feature space. And this algorithm is then able to go through and say which groupings of these have different densities, so which ones have more and which ones have less, identifying to that cluster, and what light curves actually don't sit in with any of the clusters as well. So this is something called noise when we're talking about clustering, which sounds uninteresting, but actually can be the most interesting things you'll find. So this is an example of one field's worth of light curves clustered, and this is projected using a TSNE. And so what's important to know about the TSNE is that it's now collapsing down our 25 features, collapsing them down into 2 dimensions again for our little human brain, and then trying to project them in a way that we can understand. So TSNE does really well at taking the most densely based cluster, most closely related features, and spreading them out. So that grey blob you see there is all about unchanging light curves for a night's worth of data, and it's very well spread out because they are so densely related in feature space. What we can see though is that we have a little purple cluster up in the right and a nice green cluster as well, which when we look at these further, they are similar light curves. So they're either flare stars or variable stars. And then we also have our unclustered, which I've color coded in black. And so we see that the unclustered light curves, they don't really belong with the group. They kind of sit on the outskirts. And that is again our noise in the data. But these can mean that they are so different to the groups. They have such different features that they can be very, very interesting or anomalous. So we'll touch on them a little bit later. This is another example of clustering done on a different field. This time the field was observed with a different method. So when we're observing with optical telescopes, we can either do a stare pattern or a dither pattern. So when you stare at a single patch of sky, the telescope's not moving. This is good because you don't end up getting janky looking light curves where sources are dropping in and out of CCDs as you dither. However, you do miss a lot of volume because of CCD gaps. You can then dither, so you stare at one spot and do a 5-point dither around it, which is good for filling in those chip gaps, so you know exactly what's happening in the field. However, this is bad with your light curves because you get these very interesting looking light curves because sources are falling on and off CCD gaps and the brightness is changing just because there weren't enough pixels to pick up the brightness, which can be very well categorized with machine learning and then filtered out. But we use this to see if it could identify the different types of issues that we had, and it did a great job at doing it. So again, all of these different colors are different clusters. Everything that is in purple was all of our problems from dithering. So all of those light curves that had very similar temporal shapes got clustered together, which is very nice to see. And then all of our different ones, whether it be variable sources, flare sources, also got clustered together. So it was just a good example of giving it a quite complex data set because there was very, very different light curves in there to see if it could solve the problem. And so from all of this work, we find a few things. We find that it's really good at finding steady light curves, can find our variable sources, can also cluster out for us just our faint sources that keep going above and below detection threshold, which is very useful. So we do want to keep an eye on them. It's able to filter out edge CCD sources very, very easily, and then also sources that are affected by artifacts such as cosmic rays or hot pixels. But the most interesting thing is that it gives us this group of noise or the unclusterable light curves. So light curves that were so different to the sample, the algorithm HDB scan didn't know where to put it. And this is where we hunt for gold, because these hopefully are going to be the most interesting light curves that we see astrophysically. So to interrogate them a little further, I worked with Michelle Lochner and Bassett et al. To be able to build something called Astronomy. And Michelle did a fantastic job at building this interface where you basically drop in your features, drop in your light curve files, and you can run different algorithms on it. So we utilized it using the isolation forest. So for those unclustered light curves, we chucked all of them into here, run an isolation forest on it to rank them with anomaly scores. So basically the ones that sat furthest away from the forest were considered the most anomalous, and we looked at them first. And this was a very good way of being able to find the interesting things or the things that were very, very different very quickly. More of that is in those two papers there. But doing that, we were able to find a myriad of things. We found a heap of known variables that were already catalogued, a lot of unknown variables that were not catalogued or not flagged in different catalogues or surveys. And we also were able to retrieve different types of flare stars. So both classical flares, which last for 10 to 20 minutes, they're quite distinctive, and something called an ultra-fast flare, which is until about a year or so ago, they were less well understood because they do happen very, very quickly. And that is that example right there on the bottom next to that 85,000 plus light curves, where we get a very quick peak and a very quick fall in our light curves. So this was a really good project to be able to say, yes, it worked, and then for us to decide what we wanted to use this algorithm to find next. And so I chose to use it on flare stars because we did find those ultra fast flare stars, and at the time only Galax had published work on these less than 5-minute duration flare stars, and we wanted to see in our data sample, did we get a good sample of them, because our data is kind of ripe for it. We look both in and out of the galactic plane during the survey, and we have that very fast cadence, so it leans nicely to it. So flare stars are really interesting because there's some awesome just fundamental physics happening with magnetic dynamos. But in general, a flare tends to occur when you have magnetic reconnection. So when you have a star with very large or very active magnetic field lines, when two also connect, it can break that path of the electron. So when we see, and this is a very dramatic artist's interpretation of what a flare star might look like, but if we look at stars, or if we look at our own sun and we see those looping, I forget, prominences, I'm not sure, I forget what they're called when we look at them in a solar telescope, but we can actually see the electrons in the plasma looping around these magnetic field lines, and they're kind of trapped in the field lines. When you break them, that's when we can get a surge of immense amount of energy just spewing out into the interstellar medium, or the solar system surrounds. And so these are fascinating for a few different reasons. One is it can tell us a lot about the evolution of the star, and how magnetic fields change over time depending on the spectral type of the star. Because as you'll see a little bit later on in this talk, that the majority of flares occur on our very low mass stars, the ones that tend to have higher percentage of convection happening in the actual star itself. And they're also very interesting for actually understanding possible evolution or habitability of life on other planets. So these flares, which again we'll get to in a little bit, that tend to happen on these low mass stars, what is fascinating about them is that M dwarfs, or very low mass stars, they make up at least 50% of our stellar population in our galaxy, and most likely in the entire universe. At least 50% of stars are these very low mass M dwarfs. And what we find from surveys such as Kepler and TESS is that these actually are fantastic places for rocky planets to form when the solar systems are forming back all that time ago. And this is fascinating because we think life needs a rocky planet to survive, or at least everything we know here on Earth. We need a nice rocky planet. We need a planet with an atmosphere. We need water, all that good stuff. But if we lived around an M dwarf, would we have been annihilated just from radiation from the actual star itself? And they tend to flare for very, very long periods. So very long flare frequency distribution. So they flare for thousands of years at different frequencies. And so this is a really cool question and problem that I am interested in, and I like to think about, because I think it is fun to think that, oh my goodness, 50% of stars that could possibly have life, it could be hindered by these flares. But when I get to it, it also could help life as well. So there's some theoretical papers out there, more exoplanet stuff, that talks about the fact that UV radiation could be needed and actually essential for being able to start some of the chemical processes for basic life in an early Earth scenario. And so then we have the other hand where these places could be very good for life, because they do have maybe what our early sun was able to do billions of years ago. So yeah, lots of interesting things. So that's why I like flares. And we wanted to also do some sanity checks with our data as well. Again, we had large amounts of data, so we wanted to sanity check the work that we see on traditional flare stars and look at the different durations. We wanted to see, is there a larger population of short duration flares now that we have the data? We wanted to check our flare activity over galactic declination. So we tend to see younger M dwarfs in the galactic plane, and younger M dwarfs tend to be more flary, for lack of a better adjective, based on their magnetic field strength, and they tend to have shorter duration flares as well, which we'll show in a little bit. But we just wanted to double check, did that stay true with short duration flares, or was that for more traditional flares on larger stars such as K and F dwarfs? We also wanted to investigate energy distributions of flares. So flare energy can range very largely. So the flares that we tend to see on our sun are about 10 to the 23 erg per second energy release, and that is one of the higher flares that we would ever see on the sun. So that is an X-class solar flare. However, super flares that we tend to see on other stars, especially M dwarfs and F stars, is much, much higher. So we tend to see things from 10 to the 34 to 10 to the 36 erg per second in the energy release. So that is a lot of energy. And one of the motivations for this study is we wanted to see, can that amount of energy, very large amounts of energy, be released in a short duration flare? So be released over a 5-minute period or so, or do we need long duration flares to do that? And then another thing was to also investigate, do short duration flares happen on other spectral types? Is the reason we see that most flares happen on M dwarfs just because short duration flares are happening on G stars, which turns out not the case, again, because of convective envelopes, but still we wanted to double check that now that we have the data to look at these fast cadence flares, what are they doing? And so we did a distance limited sample of 500 parsecs in our 12 fields. And this is just one beautiful, this is my favorite flare that I've found. This is what we call monster flare. And it's a very good example of a classical flare. And so it rises just over 6 magnitudes within 2-minute period. And then it falls back down to its quiescent state over about an hour. And so these are some properties of flares that are interesting. So we want to find, what is the delta magnitude? What is the change in duration over time? And some other features we can get out of them. This would be another example of a flare that is a more complex flare. So we don't see a smooth decline, but we see a rather bumpy decline. And one of the current theories for why we see complex flares is actually a range of flares bursting at very similar time, and we're seeing new flares adding to this temporal evolution of the light curve. And then this is an example of a very short duration flare. So really you blink and you miss it, but they can release significant amounts of energy. So that's the type of flares that we were looking at in this study. The way we were able to understand how much energy was coming out was just being able to use their quiescent baseline to then understand exactly how much more energy over the quiescent are they emitting. And so we did this for 19,000 sources, over 100,000 light curves, because we had multiple days worth of observations for each source. And we were able to pull out just under 100 flares, which was pretty good for a sample this size. I have a plot somewhere, I'm not sure if it's in this paper, if it's in a separate one, where this is a very good result for the amount of light curves that we had compared to some other surveys. So we were very happy with finding about 100 of them. And we pretty much confirmed a lot of our suspicions on what we would find just based on previous flare studies. So the majority of them were happening on low mass stars, low mass cool stars, so M dwarfs, and the occasional F. And we had also some G. No, we did not have a G. I'll have to double check that, but mainly low mass stars, which the literature said that we would. So we were very happy with that. We did see a very diverse range of energies coming from our flare, so ranging from 10 to the 31 to 10 to the 37 erg per second. So a huge range of energies. And this plot here actually plots them very nicely for us. So the energy is on the integrated flare energy. So how much energy over the duration of the flare is on the x-axis, and the duration of the flare is on the y-axis. And all of our data points are in the multicolored crosses. And what we see is that the majority of these very short duration flares, so the ones that are lasting between 3 and 5 minutes, where that blue cluster that you can see there, they tend to be very close to the galactic plane, and they tend to have lower energies, which is very interesting, because if we look at this plot and we bridge the gap a little bit between solar class X flares, so our larger solar flares, and the more traditional flares we saw on the majority of the Kepler and Galax sources, which were all M, K, and F stars. So that was quite interesting to find. Another thing we're able to do is to understand the number of flares over galactic declination, so height above or below the galactic disk. And again, we expected a lot more flares to happen in the galactic disk because of the young age of most M dwarfs compared to the outer ones, which we were able to confirm in that nice purple plot. And we were also able to do some sanity checks just for ourselves with some previous work from SkyMapper that had a flaring fraction. So the actual fraction of stars that you would expect to flare at any given height above the plane. And our results match quite nicely with what was found. And then finally, we were also able to just confirm that the majority of our flaring sources did come from those mid-type M dwarfs. So these are the ones that have majority of their radius is taken up by a majority of convection happening in the actual star itself, which again matches nicely to theory with magnetic dynamos and the actual magnetic field strength that you would find based on the convection. So that was a good check for us as well. And this is just a bit of fun that we had with using simulated data to figure out if all of our short duration flares were in fact from very young sources, because we had a hint of that a little bit in a previous plot with the galactic declination. And so using simulations from the GUMS survey based on the tangential velocity of the stars within the galactic disk. So we tend to see younger stars have a lower velocity. And what we found with our actual flare sample is that the majority of our flares tend to map nicely to that younger sample, hinting to the idea that the younger stars are most likely the more flary. Again, I don't know if flary is a word, but I would like to make it a word. So with that, thank you for letting me chat about some of the machine learning that we used and anomaly detection, and letting me chat a little bit about flare stars as well. I hope it was enjoyable and maybe learned something that might inspire you to hopefully use some of our data when it comes out. I would love to collaborate on anything with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have time for questions. You have a big clap from David.
Thank you.
I have several questions. Maybe I can start. I have a question about the something which is more technical. When you said that at the very beginning, you said that you're getting the data every 1 minute. So I had a question about the data volume and storage. How do you do that? Do you keep the data, or do you just keep the results and then you have something which is really live observation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do keep all of the data. We're very lucky here at Swinburne to have the OzStar supercomputer. We have quite a few terabytes, I think over 100 terabytes worth of data storage space specifically for the DWF program. So in real time, which I didn't get to touch on in this talk, but if you are interested, go check out the DWF website, because real time is a madhouse. It's pretty awesome. So telescope in Chile takes the data, it quickly saves it into their local storage. We transfer it immediately from their local storage to OzStar, which takes about 3 minutes per image. So we're constantly behind, but we normally batch them up in groups of 3, send them over every 3 minutes. Once it gets here on OzStar, we actually do quick processing because it is raw data. So we do all flat fielding, all those different calibrations, arcs, etc. And then also photometry calibrations. And then we run it through a difference imaging pipeline. That takes about 15 minutes for every 10 images that we do, because we tend to stack them in groups of 3 or so. And then that spits out our transient candidate results that we look at in real time. And so all of those data products are stored, including the raw images. But the images that I used for this work and for the archival database were all the very nicely, very cleanly processed data from NOAO. But yeah, it's a really good question because there is an insane amount of data.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood. You keep the data product only, or do you keep everything, like all the images every 1 minute? Every 1 minute you keep the images?
Yeah.
At some point, you make a problem.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay, because there is this question, about what in general in astronomy, when we are now with more and more, bigger data volume, the question about what do we keep in terms of of data? Do we keep the final data product, or do we keep the raw data? And I think this is a general question we have to face at some point, and maybe we can learn from what you're doing.
Yeah, so just speaking from my experience of running all of the real-time pipelines for DWF, I'm very grateful we did keep all of the raw data, because there's been many instances where we've had to go back and like one example was, for some reason we had the weirdest like ghost, like internal reflection happening in DECCAM, and it turned out that it was like a new piece of hardware that was put onto the actual prime instrument wasn't covered in the special black paint, so we're getting a weird reflection, and we had to reprocess all of our data again, because all of the data products were completely corrupt. They weren't scientifically usable at all, and if we hadn't kept the raw data, it would have been very difficult to be able to validate anything. But yeah, our program again is so tiny compared to when you get LSST. Do you keep all the data? Because that's an insane amount of data. And of course, I think the answer is yes, but do you let everyone have access to it? Probably not, just the products. Yeah.
I had another question about the flares. You said that you grabbed you study the properties of the flares, like the duration or the flux and stuff like that. Do you have enough data to study the statistics of the appearance of a flare for individual stars? I mean, how frequent the flares happen for a given star? Do you have enough data to see that already?
Yeah, fortunately, we don't have quite enough data to do that, but we do have hopefully enough data to build up a model of the short duration flare. So there's some really great, I think Davenport, actually James Davenport, who has a brilliant model of a classical flare, which combined thousands and thousands of flare light curves from one star to build this temporal model of what a classical flare should look like, which is very helpful in different algorithms. But we wanted to do that with all of our short duration flares, because about, I think 70% of our flares were short or shorter duration, so less than 8 minutes. And to build up again the temporal morphology so we could use that. But for the actual stars, no, we don't. Only a few of the stars had multiple flares on them. Yeah.
And I had maybe one last question. I have some other questions, but let's stop there. I have a question about the radio domain. I mean, when you're talking about reconnection and a particle oscillation, you think about radio emission, of course. And do you see that in the? Do you expect to see the flares in the radio domain? Is the problem a problem of spatial resolution?
Yes, so yes, we do expect to see them in the radio, depending on what type of data is being collected. But this is actually a study that is being led by Dougal Dobie as part of the DWF team. And I think he wants to look specifically at the polarization of the actual radio source from flares, because there was a study a few years ago, I forget who the author was, my apologies, but it basically was that flares, the radio polarization of the star ends up becoming more circularly polarized during a flare event. And it was just, why does this happen? But it only happened on certain flares. And so it's not clear whether this is just a particular process of that type of star system that was being interrogated, or if it is a process of different flares over different stellar classes. But definitely, yeah, looking at the radio emission would be very, very interesting, and I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
Thank you. So I don't know if anybody else want to ask a question. Otherwise, let's thank again Sara. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you. And I say goodbye, and see you next week to everyone for the next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.